I returned from Afghanistan with one frayed backpack and unopened discharge papers, only for my sister to call me a loser in front of her wealthy party guests. She threw me our father's will summary and exiled me to a rotting diesel yard. The entire town thought I inherited a worthless ruin. They did not know that beneath the cracked concrete and decades of old oil lay the key to a massive secret, a position destined to flip everything. My name is Gracie Coleman. I am 34 years old, and my boots were leaving tracks of muddy water across the pristine limestone porch of my childhood home. The rain in Blackwater Ridge, Ohio, came down in sheets, a freezing, relentless downpour that soaked right through my worn olive jacket. I had barely slept in 3 days. I had nothing to my name but the frayed canvas duffel bag slung over my shoulder, a folder of unopened discharge papers from the United States Army, and the ingrained discipline that kept my spine straight when every muscle screamed to collapse. I had survived my latest tour in Afghanistan. I just wanted a temporary place to crash and a halfway decent conversation with my sister. Instead, I found a fortress of luxury. The old driveway was jammed with at least 24 high-end cars. A valet in a sharp black vest stood under an umbrella near the massive iron gates. Soft, pretentious jazz drifted through the tall, modernized windows of the lake house our father had built. My sister, Paige, was exactly 32 years old, but tonight she looked like she was running a multi-million-dollar empire. She was a public relations and luxury events director, a woman who breathed through her social connections, survived on networking, and lived entirely for the curated image. I did not ring the bell. I knocked, a heavy, solid sound against the custom oak door. When the door swung inward, the blast of warm, vanilla-scented air hit me like a physical blow. Paige stood there, framed by the golden light of the grand foyer. She wore an emerald silk dress that clung perfectly to her frame. A champagne flute balanced delicately in her manicured hand. Her smile, practiced and brilliant for whoever she thought was arriving, instantly vanished the second her eyes locked onto mine. She did not gasp. She did not reach out to hug me. She looked at my soaked hair plastered to my forehead, my faded tactical boots, the heavy military duffel dragging against her clean threshold. Her gaze swept from my head to my toes, and her reaction was pure, unfiltered revulsion. "Gracie!" Paige hissed, her voice dropping to a frantic, furious whisper. She instinctively stepped half outside, pulling the heavy door to narrow the gap so her wealthy guests could not see the swamp creature dripping on her porch. "What on earth are you doing here right now?" "I just got back," I said, my voice hoarse from the cold and the long, exhausting transit. "I need a place to sleep, just the couch. Paige, 2 nights, maybe 3. Her eyes darted nervously over her shoulder into the glowing, crowded living room. "Are you insane? I am hosting the regional director of the State Commerce Board tonight. Half the venture capital in the county is in our living room. You cannot walk in here looking like a stray dog. You are going to humiliate me." "It is my house, too," I reminded her. Though I kept my tone level, I was too exhausted to fight. I just wanted to drop my bag and close my eyes. Paige let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "No, Gracie, it really is not." She set her champagne glass on a slim side table with a sharp clink, then turned back to me, her face hardening into a mask of pure contempt. The sisterly bond had died years ago, but tonight she was burying it under a pile of designer clothes and expensive liquor. "You have always been like this," Paige sneered, her voice a razor blade cutting through the sound of the falling rain. "Reckless, clueless, you ran off to play soldier because you could not handle the real world. And now look at you. You went to a war zone for years, and you came back with absolutely nothing. No money, no career, no future. You are a loser, Gracie, and I am not letting your spectacular failure ruin the life I have built." The word hit me harder than the freezing rain. Loser, spat out with so much venom, right on the doorstep of the home where we used to play in the front yard together. Before I could process the sting, Paige reached down, grabbed the thick canvas strap of my duffel bag, and shoved it hard, The heavy bag tumbled down the 3 limestone steps, landing with a wet thud in the puddles on the front lawn. My extra boots, my uniforms, my entire life, sinking into the mud. A few guests near the entryway turned their heads. I saw a man in a tailored charcoal suit peer through the crack in the door, his eyes wide with wealthy curiosity. Paige noticed them looking and immediately plastered on a tight, apologetic smile, waving a delicate hand as if dismissing a pesky delivery driver. She turned her furious eyes back to me. She reached into the pocket of a sleek blazer hanging near the door and pulled out a thick, folded sheaf of high-grade legal paper. She shoved it hard into the center of my chest. My reflex was to catch it before it fell. "Since you decided to ambush me, you can have this now," Paige said, her voice dripping with finality. "The lawyer released the summary of Dad's will on Tuesday. The estate is settled. I get the lake house. You get the Coleman Fleet and Diesel Yard. Read it somewhere else. Do not come back here." She stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The brass lock clicked loudly. The porch lights immediately flicked off, leaving me standing in the sudden, absolute dark. The rain continued to fall, washing over the stiff paper in my hand. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not bang my fists against the expensive wood. The military had beaten the useless, reactive panic out of me a long time ago. I stood there, breathing in the smell of wet earth and exhaust fumes from the valet lineup, feeling the cold seep deep into my bones. I walked slowly down the steps, my boots splashing in the muddy water, and hauled my heavy soaking duffel bag over my shoulder, under the dim, flickering glow of a street lamp at the end of the driveway. I unfolded the damp paper. The legal jargon was dense, but the bold print stood out clearly. Paige got the property with the view, the equity, and the prestige. I got a piece of industrial wasteland on the outskirts of town. The Coleman Fleet and Diesel Yard was an abandoned, rotting repair shop for heavy commercial rigs. It had not turned a profit in 10 years. It was a graveyard of rusted metal, shattered glass, and cracked concrete. I turned my back on the warm, glowing house and began the long walk toward the highway. The humiliation burned in my chest, a tight, hot knot that fought back against the freezing rain. My own sister had discarded me like trash in front of the town's elite. But as the long miles dragged on, the raw pain of the insult slowly gave way to a cold, razor-sharp focus. My father, Walter Coleman, was a silent, deeply calculating man. He never did anything by accident. He never wasted a single breath, let alone a finalized legal document. He built things to last, and he understood the value of every single inch of dirt he touched. Why did he leave her the crown jewel? And hand me a pile of worthless scrap? I marched straight through the storm, the wet legal paper folded carefully in my inner pocket. I did not have a warm bed. I did not have a vehicle, and I had exactly $412 to my name. But I had a destination now. I was walking straight to the diesel yard, and I was going to find out exactly what my father had buried beneath the rust. The hike took another 2 hours. By the time I reached the chain-link perimeter of the yard, it was well past midnight. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, but the wind off the flat Ohio plains cut straight through my damp uniform. I stood before the main gate, staring up at the rusted iron archway. Coleman Fleet and Diesel Yard. The letters were peeling, the C and the L completely gone, swallowed by years of neglect. I slipped through a gap where the fence had bowed outward, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. The compound was vast and silent, wrapped in the oppressive scent of stale motor oil, wet rust, and freezing metal. A massive corrugated steel building dominated the center of the lot, its main roll-up bay door sagging off its tracks like a broken jaw. Instinct took over. Muscle memory from years of clearing compounds in hostile territory kicked in before I even realized what I was doing. I did not walk up to the front door and turn the knob. I dropped my bag behind a stack of rotting tires and did a full perimeter sweep. I checked every window, every secondary exit, tracing the layout of the main garage and the attached office block. The place was dead. I found a side door near the office with a broken lock, forced it open with a hard shove of my shoulder, and stepped inside. The air in the office was thick with a decade of undisturbed dust. I closed the door behind me and immediately jammed a heavy wooden chair under the handle. I checked the corners, sweeping the pitch-black room with my eyes before blindly feeling along the wall for a switch. I flipped it. Nothing happened. I tried a second one. A single, bare fluorescent bulb flickered to life in the back hallway, buzzing like an angry hornet and casting a sickly, pale yellow light across the room. The reality of my inheritance crashed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The power was unstable. There was clearly no hot water, and probably no running water at all. The floor was covered in stained linoleum peeling at the corners. Filing cabinets stood empty and rusted. This was not a business. It was a graveyard. A wave of profound defeat washed over me, threatening to break the composure I had maintained on that pristine front porch. I had survived a war, only to be banished to a decaying tomb. But I could not afford to freeze, and I could not afford to fall apart. I forced my breathing to slow. I started scavenging. In the bottom drawer of a battered metal desk, I found a heavy-duty yellow flashlight with batteries that miraculously still held a charge. In a supply closet, I uncovered a dusty but intact blue plastic tarp, a basic mechanic's toolkit in a red metal box, and a heavy insulated water jug. It was not much, but it was enough to survive the night. I dragged the tarp into the corner of the office, furthest from the windows, and laid it out. I stripped off my soaked jacket, wrapped myself in a dry wool blanket from my duffel, and sat against the peeling wallpaper. Sleep was impossible. The cold seeped through the floorboards, and the silence of the yard was too loud. I pulled the flashlight and the crumpled summary of the will from my pocket. I smoothed the damp paper over my knee and read the words again. The legal jargon was dense, but as I read it a third time, the gears in my exhausted brain started to catch. The legal description of the land parcel was exceptionally long. It spanned 2 full paragraphs, detailing coordinates and boundary lines that seemed far too complex for a simple, square gravel lot. And then I noticed the page numbers. The summary ended on page 4, but a clause at the bottom of the page explicitly referenced stipulations outlined in Appendix B and Appendix E. There were no appendices attached. I stared at the buzzing fluorescent light down the hall. My father, Walter Coleman, was a man of agonizing precision. He was the kind of man who measured twice, cut once, and then measured the cut just to be sure. He never filed a messy tax return, and he certainly never signed off on sloppy legal documents. He spoke very little, but every word he wrote down mattered. If there were appendices, they were important. The fact that they were missing from the summary page had practically shoved down my throat was not a clerical error. It was a glaring, flashing warning light. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in a dull, bruised gray, I got up. My joints ached, stiff from the cold floor and the lingering dampness in my clothes. I grabbed the flashlight and walked out into the main workshop. In the daylight, the garage was massive. It easily housed 4 heavy-duty vehicle lifts, surrounded by towering steel shelves, but as I walked the floor, my eyes adjusted to the details. The place had been abandoned for nearly 10 years, yet it did not feel entirely forgotten. I stopped near the center of the shop, my brow furrowing. Over by the heaviest hydraulic lift, a massive industrial generator and an air compressor were draped in thick, heavy-duty canvas covers. They were tied down with pristine nylon ropes. No one leaves good rope on scrap metal for a decade. The knots were tight, deliberate, and entirely weatherproofed. I moved closer to the lift, shining my beam across the floor. The entire shop was coated in a thick, uniform layer of unwashed, oily grime. But right next to the reinforced concrete base of the lift, there was a rectangular patch where the dust was different. It was lighter. I crouched down, running my bare fingers over the concrete. The grime here had not settled naturally over years. It had been disturbed, wiped away, and then a thin layer of new dirt had been kicked over it to blend in. I pressed my palm flat against the stone, There was a hairline seam in the concrete, a perfect, straight line that did not match the natural stress cracks of an old floor. It looked exactly like a heavy slab that had been shifted out of place, then carefully lowered back down. I stood up, wiping the grease onto my pants. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm in my chest. I had exactly $412 in my bank account. I had no running water, no heating, and no allies in this town. But looking at that perfectly hidden seam in the floor, a cold clarity washed away the exhaustion. My father had not left me a pile of rotting garbage. He had left me a locked door, and I was going to pry it wide open. I braced my boots against the damp concrete and pushed the first 55-gallon oil drum. It shrieked as the rusted bottom dragged across the floor. I shoved 2 more out of the way, my breathing echoing in the cavernous garage. The space I cleared revealed the precise edge of a heavy steel plate, perfectly recessed into the foundation. I walked back to the office, grabbed the heavy crowbar from the scavenged toolkit, and wedged the flattened tip into the hairline seam. It took me 15 minutes of brutal, agonizing leverage to break the decades-old seal. My shoulders burned, but the metal finally groaned and popped upward. I hooked my fingers under the lip and hauled it back. A rush of cool, perfectly dry air washed over my face. It did not smell like rotting oil or dead earth. It smelled like paper and dust. I clicked on my heavy yellow flashlight and pointed the beam down. A narrow set of industrial steel stairs descended into the darkness. I climbed down slowly, the metal steps solid and silent under my boots. At the bottom, I found a pull string. I gave it a sharp tug. 3 rows of overhead LED shop lights flickered on sequentially, illuminating a space that made my breath catch in my throat. This was not a messy cellar. It was a subterranean archive, climate-controlled by a quiet, battery-backed dehumidifier humming in the corner. The walls were lined with heavy-duty metal shelving units, bolted to the concrete and organized with military precision. Every shelf was packed with thick, identical black binders, each meticulously labeled with white block lettering. I walked down the narrow aisle, reading the spines, property taxes, topographical survey maps, commercial repair permits, heavy transport contracts. Then, the labels shifted to things that had nothing to do with fixing trucks: geotechnical engineering reports, fiber optic corridor blueprints, State Transit Authority correspondence. The dates on the binders spanned the last 12 years, ending just months before my father passed away. At the very back of the room, sitting alone on a heavy wooden workbench, was a Graham fireproof lockbox. A piece of white masking tape was stuck to the top. Written in my father's sharp, unmistakable handwriting were 2 words: for Gracie. The latch was unlocked. I flipped it open. Inside lay a thick stack of notarized documents: a silver USB drive, 3 separate manila folders bearing the bold heading Coleman Transition Trust, and a sealed white envelope. I picked up the envelope, slid my thumb under the flap, and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stationery. The letter was dated 14 months ago. Gracie, the letter began. If you are reading this, you found the basement. You also know by now that I left the lake house and the liquid accounts to your sister. I did not do this to punish you. I did it because Paige is fragile in ways she masks with money, and she lacks the discipline to hold a defensive line. I gave her the shiny things to keep her distracted. I left you the armor. I leaned against the workbench, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. "This yard is not dead," he wrote. "For the last 10 years, the county has been quietly drafting a massive infrastructure expansion. They are building a new commercial transit connector and a primary subterranean fiber optic highway. The main artery for both of these projects intersects directly underneath this property. I knew this long before the state finalized their private surveys. I bought the yard, shut down the failing repair business, and waited." I stopped reading for a second, my mind racing. My father had intentionally let the business die. He had played the part of a failing mechanic to keep the property taxes low and deflect attention. "I kept this secret from Paige," the letter continued, "because if she knew the projected valuation, she would have leveraged the land immediately. She would have borrowed against the future to fund her current lifestyle. turning our strongest asset into a mountain of debt before the state even broke ground. She cares about the stage. She does not care about the foundation. You understand discipline. You understand holding a position until the tactical advantage is yours. I set the letter down and opened the first folder labeled Coleman Transition Trust. My father had not just waited, he had actively fortified the position. The documents were a labyrinth of legal brilliance. Over the past decade, he had systematically purchased adjacent easement rights and crucial service road access points. He had also set up a dummy limited liability company, legally shielding his ownership of a tiny, seemingly useless strip of land bordering the yard. I read through the surveyor notes and the legal definitions. That tiny strip of land was the only viable access point for the heavy machinery the state would need to lay the fiber optic cables. By owning the yard, the easements, and that secondary access parcel, my father had created an absolute chokehold on the entire regional project. The second massive revelation hit me when I reached the final page of the trust agreement. The state project was slated for public announcement in less than 90 days. But the rights my father had accumulated were not passive. They required the legal owner of the diesel yard to actively claim and file the finalized deeds within a specific, rapidly closing window after his death. It was a dead man's switch. If the paperwork was not executed by someone who knew the exact chain of title, the state could claim eminent domain on the abandoned property for pennies on the dollar. He left me the property, but more importantly, he left me the lever to control it, and he ensured that I was the absolute only person on earth who held the complete map. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back into the fireproof box. I looked around the silent, brilliantly organized room. The cold, wet humiliation I had felt standing on Paige's front porch just a few hours ago completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, steady heat radiating in my chest. My sister had stood in front of her wealthy, connected friends and called me a loser who came back from a war zone with absolutely nothing. She thought she had won the entire world while I was handed a pile of rusted trash. I clicked off the flashlight. She had no idea. The night she threw me out in the freezing rain was the exact moment she handed me the keys to the most powerful, legally impenetrable fortress our family had ever built. I was not a loser, I was the landlord, and the rent was about to come due. I did not storm the lake house the next morning. Anger is a cheap, fast-burning fuel, and I needed something that would last. I chose the strategy of going painfully slow to ensure I won completely clean. Using a portion of the small emergency cash reserve I found inside the fireproof box, I retained Nolan Pierce. Nolan was an estate attorney located 2 towns over, a man who drove a 10-year-old sedan and had zero social ties to the Blackwater Ridge elite. I brought him the lockbox contents and the damp, abbreviated summary my sister had shoved into my chest. Nolan spent 3 solid hours cross-referencing the paperwork in his quiet, wood-paneled office. His conclusion was clinically precise. The packet I was handed on that porch was missing 8 crucial pages of appendices. Someone had selectively curated my inheritance notification to keep me blind to the structural mechanics of the estate. But Nolan alone was not enough. This was a multi-front war, and I needed specialized operators. On his strict recommendation, I hired 2 more experts on contingency, leveraging the explicit clauses within the trust to guarantee their fees. Elise Rowan was a razor-sharp land and zoning lawyer who knew the municipal code better than the city planners. Vera Sloan was a forensic accountant who looked at corporate ledgers the way a sniper looks through a scope. I set up a secure digital communication channel, scanned the basement archives, and let them loose on the files my father had painstakingly gathered over the last decade. Vera was the first to report back, and her findings systematically dismantled the grand illusion of my sister's empire. Paige was not actually wealthy. She was dangerously leveraged. Vera tracked the public filings, the corporate credit lines, and the property tax records. My sister was surviving entirely on aggressive refinancing, revolving high-interest business credit, and short-term luxury branding contracts. Her cash flow was incredibly fragile, held together by nothing more than the perception of her wealth and success. She was constantly shifting money from one account to another just to maintain the appearance of liquidity if one major bank called in a note, or if one high-profile client backed out. Her entire financial facade would collapse within 30 days. Elise followed up exactly 48 hours later with her analysis of the dirt. She verified the county zoning overlays and the state's impending transit corridor project. The true value was exactly where my father said it was, the precise intersection of the infrastructure rights. But Elise pointed out the immediate tactical advantage we held. Because of the specific, ironclad legal framework my father established through the trust, Paige had absolutely zero legal authority to represent the broader family legacy in any commercial negotiations regarding the surrounding acreage. If Paige was currently out there trying to use the family name to woo venture capitalists or secure new credit, she was selling a bridge she did not legally own. Then Nolan called to deliver a twist that shifted the entire landscape from simple greed to outright fraud. In reviewing the final probate filings and the digital correspondence logs, he noticed a glaring discrepancy. Several critical emails releasing secondary, non-essential assets to Paige's direct control had been sent from my father's personal computer during his final 2 weeks in the hospice facility. I knew for a fact he was heavily medicated on high doses of morphine during that exact 14-day window. The timestamps on those emails were highly suspicious, logged at 2 and 3 in the morning when the nursing staff explicitly noted in his medical charts that he was completely unresponsive. Someone had been sitting at his keyboard in the dark, staging consent to solidify control before the estate even went to the probate courts. The probability that Paige had guided or entirely fabricated those communications was overwhelming. I did not hesitate. I instructed Nolan to file an immediate records preservation order with the county court. We simultaneously filed a motion to temporarily freeze any commercial transactions, asset leveraging, or title transfers related to the disputed portions of the entire estate. It was a quiet, highly bureaucratic maneuver, buried deep in the daily municipal docket where the socialites never looked, but it was a tripwire. The exact moment Paige or her creditors tried to move serious money based on the estate's perceived overall value, the banking system would lock them out, and she would not know why until it was too late. While my legal team laid the invisible minefield across the county, I made sure to stay highly visible at the rotting diesel yard. I bought a cheap, battery-powered radio, a heavy push broom, and a few gallons of discount white paint from the local hardware store. Whenever Paige's sleek black luxury vehicle coincidentally cruised past the chain-link fence on her way into town, I made absolutely sure I was out front. I would sweep the uneven gravel or clumsily patch a rusted doorframe. I wore my grease-stained military coveralls and let her see me eating cold deli sandwiches while sitting on a rusted folding chair. I played the part of the desperate, broken veteran trying to make a pathetic, dirt-poor home out of a junkyard, and she swallowed it whole. Every single time she drove by, I could almost feel her smug, dismissive satisfaction radiating through the tinted glass of her car. She was looking right at me, underestimating my intelligence, my discipline, and my endurance all over again. She thought I was just trying to survive the week, sitting on that folding chair as the sun dipped below the jagged industrial horizon, eating a stale sandwich in the cold. I realized the true nature of this operation. This was never going to be a screaming match in a pristine driveway. It was not about explosive vengeance fueled by raw, uncontrollable anger. It was about meticulously peeling the glossy paint off a system entirely built on toxic debt, fabricated image, and profound contempt. I was going to let her keep dancing under the spotlight, entirely unaware that I was already down in the dark, systematically dismantling the stage beneath her feet. The trust provided a specific allocation for property maintenance, and I intended to use every single cent of it exactly as my father designed. The repairs began on a Tuesday morning. The first priority was the grid. I hired an independent electrician to stabilize the power, replacing the blown fuses and rewiring the main breaker box so I no longer had to rely on a flickering fluorescent bulb. Once the electricity was steady, I tackled the massive roll-up bay doors. It took 2 full days of grinding rust off the tracks and heavily lubricating the heavy steel rollers. But eventually, I could open the main garage to the cool autumn air with a single, firm pull of the iron chain. I did not stop at the exterior. Inside the office, I dragged out the waterlogged carpets, scrubbed the linoleum with industrial bleach, and set up a proper workspace. I found a solid oak desk in the back of the storage room, polished the grime off the surface, and arranged a small, clean reception area with 2 decent leather chairs I bought secondhand for $40. I spent an entire weekend clearing out the parts warehouse, cataloging salvageable belts, heavy-duty filters, and intact tools, throwing the absolute garbage into a rented dumpster. Finally, I hauled down the shattered plastic pricing board in the front window and replaced it with a clean chalkboard. The workload was too heavy for one person, so I posted a simple flyer on the bulletin board at the local hardware store offering short-term hourly shifts. 2 men showed up the next morning. One was a combat engineer who had done a tour overseas a decade before me, a quiet guy named Marcus who knew how to turn a wrench and did not ask unnecessary questions. The other was an older, barrel-chested mechanic named Dale. Dale had known Walter Coleman. As we spent the afternoons reorganizing the heavy engine hoists, Dale filled in the silent gaps my father had left behind. He told me that 3 or 4 years ago. Walter started taking long lunches, driving out to the county line to meet with men wearing hard hats and carrying rolled-up blueprints. He never talked about it at the diner, Dale told me one afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag. But I asked him once why he was keeping company with the city planners instead of fixing rigs. Your dad just looked at me and said he did not want anyone burning the money before the job was done. He meant your sister. Of course, everybody in town knew she had a hole in her pocket that went straight to the center of the earth. That evening, while going through the final boxes in the back office, I found a small, black leather notebook tucked beneath a stack of old invoices. It was filled with my father's cramped handwriting. Most of it was basic math and supply lists, but on the very last page, written in thick blue ink, were 2 sentences. Do not confuse flash with an asset. Do not confuse noise with ownership. I tore the page out and pinned it to the corkboard directly above my new desk. Paige decided to grace the yard with her presence on a Friday afternoon. She pulled her sleek silver sports utility vehicle right up to the newly cleared bay doors, the tires crunching over the fresh gravel I had laid down that morning. She stepped out wearing a tailored cream-colored pantsuit, sharp stilettos, and an oversized pair of designer sunglasses. She looked like she was on her way to a charity gala, which she probably was. She stood near the entrance, visibly avoiding a small puddle of runoff water, and looked around the organized, brightly lit garage. She did not look impressed. She looked deeply amused. "So this is it," Paige said, her voice echoing off the corrugated steel roof. "You really are turning yourself into a lifelong mechanic. I guess you finally found your level, Gracie, scrubbing floors and playing in the dirt." I was standing near the air compressor, wiping engine grease from my knuckles with an orange towel. I did not raise my voice. I did not even stop cleaning my hands. "You are living on something you have not finished paying for," I said quietly, looking her directly in the eyes. "I am fixing what already belongs to me." The smug smile instantly dropped from her face. Her jaw tightened, and for a split second, I saw a flash of genuine panic break through the thick layer of expensive makeup. She spun on her heel, marched back to her vehicle, and slammed the door. As she peeled out of the lot, throwing gravel into the street, I knew exactly why that specific sentence had hit a nerve. Elise and Vera had informed me that morning that Paige's primary lender had just frozen her latest credit request. The bank underwriters were suddenly asking her for the finalized title documents regarding the estate commercial zoning limits, documents she arrogantly assumed were already a done deal. The invisible tripwire I had laid was beginning to pull tight around her ankles. I went back into the office to file away the receipts from the day. I pulled an old dented filing cabinet away from the wall to sweep behind it, and a thick, yellowed envelope fluttered to the ground. It must have fallen behind the drawers years ago. The postage mark was dated 4 years prior. I picked it up and brushed off the dust. The return address belonged to Ridgway Freight Partners, one of the largest national logistics conglomerates on the eastern seaboard. Inside was a printed itinerary for a closed-door meeting with Walter Coleman, specifically referencing an advanced survey of a high-capacity shipping corridor. It was the final, undeniable piece of proof. The infrastructure project was not just a county rumor or a speculative municipal dream. It was a fully capitalized corporate reality, and the corporate giants were already mapping the route straight through the dirt I was standing on. Later that night, the contrast could not have been sharper. I opened my phone and saw a local society page update. Paige had posted a perfectly curated series of photos from an extravagant dinner party at the lake house. She was holding a crystal wine glass, surrounded by smiling investors, standing in a house entirely mortgaged against a lie. I locked the screen and tossed the phone onto my desk. I walked outside and sat down on my rusted folding chair just outside the main garage. The night air was freezing, and my hands were still stained with black grease from the heavy rollers. My back ached from 12 hours of hard labor. But as I looked out over the quiet, dark expanse of the Coleman Fleet and Diesel Yard, I felt a profound, unbreakable sense of calm. For the very first time since I stepped off that transport plane, I had a completely clear direction. The man who walked onto my freshly graveled lot on a Thursday afternoon did not belong in Blackwater Ridge. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than the emergency cash reserve sitting in my fireproof box. He stepped carefully around a patch of damp earth, his polished leather shoes completely out of place against the industrial backdrop. I was standing by the open bay doors, organizing a rack of heavy steel wrenches, my hands dusted with chalk and dry grease. He approached me with the easy, condescending smile of a man who assumed he was the smartest person in the room. He introduced himself as a regional acquisitions director for Ridgway Freight Partners. He handed me a glossy business card and asked if the property manager or the estate executor was on site. He took one look at my worn coveralls and cataloged me as a temporary laborer hired to clean out a dead man's mess. I did not correct him. I leaned against the doorframe, crossed my arms, and let him talk. Assuming I was out of the loop, he adopted a casual, conspiratorial tone. He mentioned that Ridgway was pushing hard to finalize their logistics connections by the end of the quarter. He let it slip that they were preparing to lock down the routing coordinates for the new heavy transit corridor, and they needed to clear up the title friction on this specific parcel before the state broke ground. It was a classic corporate pressure tactic, designed to panic a low-level manager into passing an urgent message up the chain of command. I took his card, looked at the embossed gold lettering, and slid it into my breast pocket. I kept my voice entirely flat. I told him he could direct all future inquiries to Elise Rowan, my lead counsel, and I recited her office number from memory. The condescending smile vanished from his face as he realized he had just tipped his hand directly to the owner. 30 minutes later, I was on a secure call with Elise. When I relayed the conversation, she let out a sharp breath of vindication. Ridgway moving to finalize meant the clock was officially ticking, but Elise had spent the last 3 days diving deeper into the specific clauses my father had baked into his land holdings, and she had uncovered the real masterstroke. Walter Coleman had not merely hoarded access rights to sell them to the highest bidder. He had structured a highly specific conditional transfer agreement with the county zoning board years ago. If the owner of the diesel yard simply sold the empty, abandoned dirt, the state could cap the buyout price at standard market value. But if the owner was actively operating a fully compliant, commercially viable service facility on the premises at the time the state exercised its eminent domain or corporate buyout options, the required compensation multiplier skyrocketed. The law dictated they would have to pay for the disruption of an active, essential commercial enterprise, drastically increasing the valuation. That was the true reason my father left the property to me. He did not need a socialite who would instantly liquidate the land for a quick cash grab. He needed a soldier. He needed someone with the discipline to wake up before dawn, scrub the concrete, fix the doors, and endure the brutal physical labor required to bring a dead business back to life. He knew I had the grit to hold the position and activate the massive hidden value. However, Elise warned me that there was a landmine buried in the paperwork. The environmental surveys from 15 years ago flagged a secondary subparcel near the back fence. It carried a high risk of deep soil contamination from decades of old diesel spillage. If we triggered the corporate buyout and Ridgeway inspectors found unregulated hazardous waste, the resulting federal fines and mandated cleanups would completely drain the trust and leave me bankrupt. It was a fatal vulnerability. I hung up the phone and went straight back down into the subterranean archive. I pulled the specific binder labeled with the environmental survey dates. My father, true to his nature, had not left me exposed. Tucked behind the hazard report was a step-by-step instructional file. He had drafted an entire contingency plan utilizing the Blackwater County Brownfield Restoration Grant, a municipal fund specifically designed to subsidize industrial cleanup. Below the grant applications was a typed list of 3 highly discreet, state-certified remediation contractors he had thoroughly vetted. The problem was severe, but he had already provided the tactical solution. Just as I was reviewing the contractor list, my encrypted tablet chimed. It was Vera Sloan. She had just cracked open the latest financial disclosures Paige had filed with her private equity backers. Vera's voice over the speaker was laced with professional disgust. Paige was not just drowning in debt. She was actively committing investment fraud. She was currently raising a massive new fund for a luxury commercial development she called the Coleman Legacy Corridor, planned for the land surrounding the lake house, to convince her wealthy investors that the project was viable. Her pitch deck explicitly promised them exclusive, guaranteed access to the upcoming state transit and fiber optic lines. She was telling them she had the authority to route the heavy infrastructure right through the diesel yard to service her luxury park. I sat back in my chair, staring at the concrete wall of the bunker, the pieces slammed into place. Paige had not just insulted me on her porch because she was embarrassed by my clothes. She was utterly terrified of me. She had built her brand, her professional reputation, and her most recent multi-million-dollar capital raise on the illusion that she controlled the entire family estate. She was selling rights that legally belonged to me. I had a choice to make. I could instruct Elise to contact Ridgeway Freight Partners right now, negotiate a standard early buyout, take a very comfortable settlement, and walk away from Blackwater Ridge forever. It would be safe. It would be easy. But as I looked around the meticulously organized room my father had built in secret, I knew I was not going to take the easy way out. I was not going to sell early. I was going to follow the plan. I would hire the environmental contractors, secure the Brownfield grant, and officially reopen the Coleman Fleet and Diesel Yard as a fully functioning commercial entity. I would fortify my legal position until it was completely impenetrable. I would let Paige keep building her glittering tower of lies. I would let her sign the contracts and take the investors' money. I would let her climb as high as she possibly could, relying on a foundation she did not own, until the exact moment the truth pulled the earth out from under her. The shift in my sister's strategy began exactly 4 days after the bank froze her credit line. Paige did not show up in her expensive car this time. She called me on a Tuesday morning, using a tone I had not heard since we were teenagers. It was soft, dripping with manufactured sisterly concern, masking the razor blade underneath. She told me she was worried about me. She said the physical labor was beneath me, that living in an industrial wasteland was a clear sign I was struggling to readjust to civilian life. Then came the pivot. She offered to buy the yard from me for $150,000. She framed it as an act of profound generosity, a quick cash infusion so I could move to the city and find a nice apartment. I listened to her pitch, the silence stretching over the line until she breathlessly finished. I told her the property was not for sale at any price and hung up the phone. By Thursday afternoon, the retaliation started. Dale came into the garage after his lunch break at the local diner. Looking deeply uncomfortable, he told me people were talking. Paige had spent the last 48 hours having quiet, concerned coffees with the Blackwater Ridge elite, planting a very specific narrative. She was telling the local investors, the county board, and anyone who would listen that my time overseas had broken me. She whispered that I was deeply unstable, prone to erratic behavior, and completely unfit to manage a commercial property. It was a calculated, devastating strike aimed directly at my credibility, right as I was preparing to file the brownfield grant applications. The instinct to march to the lake house and tear her pristine image to shreds was overwhelming. But I had learned how to suppress reactionary anger a long time ago. Instead of exploding or threatening a defamation lawsuit, I called Nolan. I instructed him to quietly gather sworn affidavits from Dale, Marcus, and the local vendors I interacted with daily. I also had him subpoena the emails and text messages of 2 local contractors Paige had spoken to. We built a silent, ironclad wall of character evidence while she continued to dig her own grave. While I documented her smear campaign, Nolan went on the offensive in the municipal court. He filed a formal petition citing Paige for actively obstructing access to the estate assets and intentionally withholding material documents during the initial probate period. It was a severe escalation, one that forced her lawyers to scramble and explain the missing appendices to a highly irritated judge. The pressure was working, and it caused a fracture in Paige's inner circle. The very next morning, Vera contacted me with a massive breakthrough. A former executive assistant of Paige, a young woman quietly fired 2 months prior without severance, had reached out. She handed Vera the absolute holy grail of corporate fraud. It was the master draft of the pitch deck Paige was using to solicit venture capital for her fictional development. I sat at my polished oak desk and scrolled through the high-resolution PDF. There, on page 12, was a beautifully rendered architectural mock-up bearing the logo for the Coleman Legacy Corridor. The rendering explicitly highlighted the commercial access roads and the subsurface fiber optic routing, explicitly claiming those rights were fully secured by Paige's holding company. She was using my land, the land she had just tried to buy for pennies, to secure millions of dollars in fraudulent investment capital. Looking at the desperate, glittering lies on the screen, my perception of my sister fundamentally shifted. She was not just an arrogant socialite playing with our father's money. She was a woman in freefall, utterly terrified, patching the holes in a sinking ship with stolen wood. The arrogance was just a shield for the blinding panic. The breaking point arrived on Friday evening. I was locking the main bay doors when I heard the sharp click of heels on the concrete. Paige marched into the yard, her face pale, her eyes burning with raw, unfiltered fury. The court filings had hit her desk. "You are trying to destroy me," she hissed, closing the distance between us until she was just a few feet away. "You have always been so bitterly jealous of everything I built. And now you are weaponizing Dad's death to drag me down into the mud with you." I turned to face her, wiping the chalk from my hands. "I am not jealous of anything you have, Paige. I am just demanding the truth on paper. You built a glass house on land you do not own." "I own the legacy of this family," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "Dad knew I was the only one who could handle the estate. That is why he signed the secondary asset releases over to me. He wanted me to have the leverage." "He was on a massive dose of liquid morphine during those 2 weeks," I stated, my voice dead calm. "He was entirely non-responsive. He did not sign anything." "You have no idea what you are talking about," Paige fired back, her breathing shallow and fast. "He was perfectly lucid. When Pierce brought the paperwork into the hospice room on that Tuesday night, Dad sat right up. He even complained about the blue ink pen the notary handed him because he only ever signed legal documents in black." The silence that followed her words was heavier than the humid night air. Paige's eyes widened. She instantly realized what she had just done. During the initial probate hearing, she had sworn under oath that she was out of state at a public relations conference during the final week of his life. She had explicitly testified that she had no direct involvement in or physical presence during the execution of those last-minute estate modifications. Yet, standing in the middle of the diesel yard, she just described the exact color of the pen the notary used on a specific Tuesday night. Inside a locked hospice room, she took a slow step backward, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. She opened her mouth to speak, to backtrack, to spin the lie, but no words came out. She turned and practically ran back to her car, the tires screeching as she fled the lot. I stood in the quiet yard, the pieces of the final puzzle locking into place. This was no longer just a tactical battle over property rights, infrastructure routing, or venture capital fraud. The fight for the diesel yard was over. The real war was about to begin, and it was going to be fought over the absolute truth of what my sister did in the dark during the final days of our father's life. The counterattack from my sister was entirely predictable. She doubled down on the spectacle. Less than a week later, heavy, embossed invitations circulated throughout the wealthiest zip codes in Blackwater Ridge for the Coleman Legacy Winter Benefit. It was billed as a black tie gala hosted at the lake house, ostensibly a charity fundraiser for community development. However, everyone in the county financial sector knew exactly what it was. It was a desperate, highly publicized attempt to save her sinking reputation, dazzle her wavering investors, and lock in the massive capital commitments she desperately needed to keep her fraudulent development afloat. She invited the regional banking directors, the municipal zoning board, the leading commercial contractors, and the local press. The town expected me to show up in my grease-stained coveralls and throw a screaming fit on the manicured lawn. They expected the unstable, broken veteran Paige had been whispering about for the last week. I decided to give them the exact opposite. Behind the scenes, the trap was already primed, 48 hours before the valet attendants even arrived at the lake house. Elise initiated a synchronized, completely silent offensive. She sent certified legal notices to every major bank, venture capital partner, and municipal oversight committee in the county. The letters officially declared an active, multi-million-dollar dispute over the title and easement rights Paige was publicly claiming. It was not a loud press release or a messy social media post. It was a precise, targeted injection of toxic doubt straight into the central nervous system of Paige's financial network. Simultaneously, Vera and Nolan coordinated the exact filing times for our transaction preservation orders. They meticulously timed the injunctions to take full legal effect at exactly 8 o'clock on the evening of the benefit. By doing this, we established a devastating legal perimeter. If Paige stood on that stage and actively solicited funds using assets she now legally knew were frozen and disputed, it escalated her actions from mere civil misrepresentation to felony wire fraud. The night before the gala, I found myself sitting at my polished oak desk in the silent garage, staring at the silver USB drive I had pulled from the fireproof box. I had reviewed the land deeds and trust documents a dozen times, but I had avoided the single video file sitting in the root directory. As the rain battered the corrugated steel roof of the shop, I finally clicked open the file. My father appeared on the screen. He looked incredibly frail, the aggressive illness having hollowed out his cheeks, but his eyes were sharp and steady. He was sitting in his worn leather armchair in the den. He did not spend the 3-minute recording yelling or listing Paige's endless faults. His voice was raspy, exhausted, and filled with a profound, quiet sadness. He explained that he loved both of his daughters, but he recognized the fatal flaw in my sister. He stared directly into the camera lens. His breathing labored. He said he could not leave the anchor to Paige. He explained that she did not see a home. She only saw a stage. If he left her the heavy things, the real things, she would sell the foundation just to buy brighter lights. He had to give her the stage so she would not destroy the ground beneath it. I sat in the dark, my hand hovering over the keyboard. A dark, vengeful part of me wanted to take that video file, walk into the lake house the next night, and project it onto the massive wall behind her while she was pouring expensive champagne for the venture capitalists. It would annihilate her instantly in front of the exact people she was trying to impress. But I remembered the discipline I had learned, and the cold, structural strategy my father had designed. I was not going to turn his dying confession into a cheap, sensational stunt for the local elite. I would hold it for the courtroom, where it would serve as an irrefutable legal testament, not a party trick. I arrived at the lake house at exactly 7 in the evening. I wore a tailored, charcoal gray suit I had purchased entirely with my own savings. My boots were polished to a mirror shine, my posture rigid and controlled. When I walked through the grand oak doors, the reaction was immediate. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned, but I did not scowl, and I did not raise my voice. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, stood near the edge of the room, and simply watched. I carried myself not as an angry victim, but as the person holding the true deed to the room. Paige was in her element, entirely radiant in a sweeping crimson gown. She glided through the room, projecting absolute invincibility. She spoke loudly about our family legacy, her visionary community development, and the massive financial returns her project would guarantee. She looked like a queen surveying her secure kingdom, laughing easily and touching the arms of the bankers. But as I observed the crowd from my quiet corner, the real story revealed itself. The investors were smiling back, but their eyes were tight. I watched the senior loan officer from the State Commerce Bank subtly pull his hand away when Paige reached for it. I saw two venture capitalists whispering intensely by the fireplace, their gazes darting nervously toward Paige and then toward me. The certified letters Elise had sent were working perfectly. The room was already infected with severe doubt. Paige's partners were privately terrified, but none of them wanted to be the first one to panic and pull their money, fearing a total collapse of their previous investments. Everyone in the room was acting. At exactly 7:45, the string quartet faded out. Paige stepped up to a small, elegantly lit podium set up near the sweeping glass windows overlooking the dark water. The room fell into an expectant hush. She tapped the microphone, a brilliant, predatory smile spreading across her face. She announced that she was thrilled to share a monumental new step forward, a massive, exclusive partnership that would cement the Coleman Legacy Corridor as the undisputed center of regional commerce. I looked down at the face of my watch. The second hand swept past the 12. It was precisely 8:00. Paige was taking a deep breath, raising her crystal glass to begin her fraudulent pitch, entirely unaware that the legal trap had just snapped shut, locking her into the most catastrophic mistake of her life. Paige tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing perfectly off the vaulted ceilings. "Tonight, I am thrilled to announce a monumental step forward. We have officially secured a strategic partnership integrating the Coleman Legacy Corridor with the upcoming State Logistics Transit Line. This guarantees our development exclusive commercial access to the new freight and fiber optic routes." She raised her glass. "To the future." Applause began to ripple through the room. It lasted exactly 15 seconds. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. Nolan Pierce and Elise Rowan walked in, flanked by two men in dark suits. One of them was the chief compliance officer for the State Commerce Bank. There was no theatrical shouting, no dramatic music. They moved with the cold, lethal efficiency of a surgical strike. Elise bypassed the bewildered guests and walked straight to the group of venture capitalists standing near the front. She handed a thick, bound legal folio to the lead investor. Nolan approached the bank executives near the bar, delivering identical packets. "What is the meaning of this?" Paige demanded from the podium, her perfect smile freezing into a rigid grimace. "This is a private, ticketed event." Elise turned to face the room. She did not need a microphone. The absolute silence of 80 wealthy people holding their breath carried her voice perfectly. "As of 8:00 this evening, the state court has granted a full preservation order and a transactional freeze on the Coleman estate," Elise stated calmly. "The transit and infrastructure access rights Ms. Coleman just described do not belong to her holding company. They are the exclusive property of the Coleman Fleet and Diesel Yard, and they are currently under active legal dispute. Any financial commitments made based on those specific rights are legally void." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. The glamorous atmosphere evaporated, replaced instantly by a suffocating, heavy dread. Men in expensive suits began setting their champagne glasses down on the nearest tables, stepping subtly backward, physically distancing themselves from the blast zone. Paige gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles turning bone white. She let out a high, artificial laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Everyone, please, this is simply a technical misunderstanding. My sister is going through a very difficult transitional period, and her legal counsel is overstepping. We have internal memos clearing all of this." "We have those memos, too," Elise replied, her tone completely devoid of pity. "Your former executive assistant provided them to our forensic accountant yesterday morning. The documents confirm that your own internal counsel explicitly warned you that you did not possess the easement titles. You received that warning 14 days ago. You then deliberately altered the master pitch deck to remove the legal disclaimers before distributing it to the investors in this room." The chief compliance officer from the bank stepped forward, his face pale with fury. "Ms. Coleman, our risk management department just reviewed the forensic data provided to us an hour ago. You did not just exaggerate a future asset. You actively leveraged disputed legacy properties to artificially inflate your credit limits and secure our initial bridging loans. That constitutes gross misrepresentation." The perfectly constructed facade shattered. Paige did not gracefully pivot or offer a slick corporate non-apology. The sheer magnitude of the exposure hit her all at once. Panic, raw and ugly, twisted her features. She stepped away from the podium, her hands shaking violently. "It was my team," Paige stammered, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate pitch. She pointed wildly at her paralyzed event staff standing near the catering doors. "They drafted the deck. They handled the compliance. I am the visionary. I do not read every single footnote." When the investors only stared back with cold, predatory anger, she whipped her head toward me. I was still standing perfectly still in my charcoal suit by the window. "This is your fault," she screamed, the sound tearing through the silent room. "You could not stand to see me succeed. You crawled back here with nothing, and you decided to burn my entire life to the ground just because you are a miserable, jealous failure." It was the first time any of these people had ever seen Paige Coleman lose control. The poised, untouchable socialite was gone, replaced by a frantic, cornered animal thrashing against a trap she had built herself. The sheer indignity of her outburst sealed her fate faster than the legal documents. Before I could even reply, a man in a black security polo shirt hurried into the room from the private hallway leading to our father's old study. He looked incredibly anxious, bypassing the crowd and leaning in to whisper urgently to the bank's compliance officer. The officer's eyes narrowed, and he nodded. "Miss Coleman," the officer said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, "your private security detail just informed me that there are clear signs of document tampering in the upstairs study. Drawers have been forced open and files moved within the last 60 minutes, directly violating the court injunction we served this morning regarding the preservation of Walter Coleman's physical records." Paige froze. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She had tried to clean up the trail right before the party, assuming the gala would distract everyone. Instead, she had just handed them a smoking gun for obstruction. The room was entirely dead. The venture capitalists were already pulling their phones out, quietly whispering to their legal teams. The bank representatives were turning their backs on her, moving toward the exit. The empire of air was collapsing in real time. Paige stared at me, her chest heaving, tears of absolute rage and terror finally spilling over her heavy makeup. She looked utterly broken. I walked slowly across the hardwood floor, stopping just a few feet from where she stood shivering. The entire room watched me, waiting for the final, explosive confrontation. They expected me to gloat, to shout, to revel in the destruction. I did not. I looked at her, seeing right through the expensive dress and the ruined makeup, straight down to the terrified, empty core. "Tonight is not the end," I said, my voice quiet, cold, and echoing clearly in the vast space. "Tonight is just the moment everyone stops believing the wrong story." I turned my back on her and walked out the heavy oak doors, leaving her alone in a room full of people who would never trust her again. The social execution was absolute. Paige's public image was completely, irreversibly destroyed. But as I stepped out into the freezing night air and walked down the long driveway, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. A destroyed reputation did not automatically sign over the deeds. The fraudulent loans, the altered will, the true ownership of the diesel yard, and the ultimate accountability for my father's final days. None of that could be settled at a party. The real reckoning was still waiting for us, completely stripped of its glamour, in the cold, unforgiving light of a courtroom. The county courthouse smelled of floor wax and old paper. There were no flashing cameras, no venture capitalists, and no string quartets. The sterile, fluorescent-lit room on the third floor was where the real weight of the world was decided. We sat at the heavy oak plaintiff table. Paige sat across the aisle, flanked by two highly expensive, highly stressed defense attorneys. She wore a simple gray suit, her posture rigid, the glittering arrogance completely stripped away. Nolan Pierce opened our case not with grand speeches, but with cardboard boxes. He meticulously submitted the original, notarized copies of the trust, mapping out the precise timeline of the filings. He presented the complete, unabridged will, explicitly highlighting the 8 crucial pages of appendices that had conveniently vanished before Paige handed me my copy on her front porch. Elise Rowan followed, laying out the undeniable topographical maps, the municipal zoning overlays, and the ironclad conditional transfer agreements my father had baked into the dirt. She dismantled Paige's claim to the transit easements in less than 20 minutes. Then Vera Sloan took the floor to establish motive. She walked the judge through a devastating, forensic autopsy of my sister's finances. Vera showed the aggressive refinancing, the maxed-out commercial credit lines, and the doctored pitch decks. She proved that Paige's frantic effort to usurp the industrial rights was not a simple misunderstanding. It was a calculated survival mechanism. Paige had desperately needed the illusion of total control over the legacy assets to prevent her own mountain of toxic debt from crushing her. The final blow was not delivered by a lawyer, it was delivered by our father. Nolan submitted a silver digital drive into evidence and requested permission to play a single file. The bailiff dimmed the overhead lights, and Walter Coleman's face appeared on the monitor mounted above the jury box. The courtroom fell completely silent. My father looked exhausted, his breathing shallow, but his mind was sharp. He did not yell. He did not humiliate Paige from beyond the grave. He spoke with the heavy, pragmatic sorrow of a man who knew exactly who his children were. He explained his decision to separate the estate. He stated clearly that he gave the lake house to Paige because she needed the comfort, but he could not entrust her with the commercial foundation. He looked directly into the camera and said he knew Paige would mortgage the future to buy brighter lights for today. He left the rusted diesel yard to me because he knew I had the endurance to stand in the dark, do the hard labor, and wait for the true value to mature. He refused to let his life's work be liquidated to feed a hollow stage. When the screen went black, I glanced across the aisle. Paige was staring at her hands, her shoulders completely slumped. She could fight my lawyers, but she could not fight the irrefutable truth spoken by the man she claimed to honor. The judge did not deliberate for long. The ruling was absolute and surgically precise. The court validated the original trust documents in their entirety. I was legally confirmed as the sole, undisputed owner of the Coleman Fleet and Diesel Yard, the dummy holding company, and all attached infrastructure easements. Furthermore, Paige was held civilly liable for probate interference and deliberate misrepresentation. She was ordered to pay heavy financial restitution to the estate for the legal fees and the damages caused by her fraudulent commercial solicitations. The lake house, once her ultimate symbol of power, instantly became a prison of liability, with her credit lines frozen and her investors fleeing. The banks began calling in their notes. The massive civil penalties meant she could no longer hide behind refinancing. She would be forced to sell off her designer assets, liquidate the property, and face the agonizing reality of living within her actual means. I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, holding a certified folder. But I did not feel the fiery, euphoric rush of vengeance. I just felt a profound, settling peace. I had chosen structured justice over emotional destruction. I used the Brownfield Municipal Grant exactly as my father had planned. I hired the specialized environmental contractors to remediate the contaminated soil near the back fence. Once the ground was cleared and certified, I initiated the final phase of the trust. I did not just sit on the land waiting for the corporate buyout. I officially reopened the commercial garage. Using a portion of the secured funds, I launched an apprenticeship program, partnering with local veterans organizations to offer transition employment for service members returning home. Marcus and Dale became my lead foremen. The yard became a sanctuary of hard work and quiet dignity. 3 months later, I saw Paige one last time. She walked up to the newly painted front gates of the yard. She was wearing plain jeans and a simple coat. She told me she had taken a mid-level administrative job at a logistics firm 2 counties over to start paying off her court-ordered debts. She did not apologize, and she did not ask for forgiveness. She simply looked at the bustling, profitable garage I had built from the ruins she threw me into. I did not offer her a hug, and I did not chase her away. I simply nodded, establishing a permanent, impenetrable boundary. She had to learn the value of things that did not look good on camera, and she had to do it on her own. Standing there in the cold morning air, watching her walk away, I finally understood the truth. I had returned from a war zone with a frayed bag and empty pockets, and she had called me a loser. But a loser is not someone who starts at the bottom with calloused hands. A loser is someone who mistakes the spotlight for an asset. The secret my father buried under the concrete was never just about the money or the land. It was the ultimate lesson in vision. It was the ability to see the indestructible foundation underneath the grime, especially when the rest of the world is entirely blinded by a fresh coat of paint. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. And if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.